Welcome to Shadow Evidence, where Oxford's grandeur conceals the shadows of betrayal and doubt. Tonight we step through the ancient gates of Christ Church, where the bells toll with solemn dignity, yet behind those cloisters a web of deceit winds tighter than any sermon or hymn. A fellowship torn, a trust broken, and a body discovered beneath the very spire that crowns the college. Was it ambition, revenge, or an older sin resurrected at last? Before this case unfolds, remind yourself, every silence speaks and every detail whispers. What detective do you admire most? Enjoy stories wrapped in riddles and secrets? You're in the right place. Subscribe to join the circle of seekers. Now light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. It was one of those Oxford evenings when the sky held a bruise of violet, the rain unwilling to fall yet clinging in the air, as though it wished to be remembered without ever having to commit itself. The bells of Christ Church moved through the mist with a melancholy that had little to do with piety. Bells never did, in my experience. They belonged to memory more than to faith, and this one drew me backwards into a time I had not yet lived. I had been sitting in the Randolph, lingering over a pint I neither wanted nor enjoyed, when I first unfolded the newspaper clipping. Nothing dramatic in the print. No sensational headline, no photograph of a smiling corpse, simply the news that Dr. Adrian Latham, fellow in classics at Christ Church, had died suddenly at the age of 52. Sudden illness, the article said, a phrase I had always found as convenient as it was useless, serving the double purpose of reassuring the public and protecting the institution. Something in the notice troubled me, though I could not have explained why. Perhaps the word sudden. Death is always sudden, except when it is not. Or perhaps it was the fact that Latham's name was familiar, though I could not place it at once. A lecture I had once drifted into, an article quoted in the Times literary supplement. He had lived among the shelves, that much was certain, and the shelves had whispered his name. Leaving the Randolph, I walked through St. Giles, past the damp scent of second-hand bookshops, and allowed the city to lead me toward the river. The cobbles glistened like old glass. A student on a bicycle brushed past, her gown caught briefly in the spokes, a fleeting reminder that youth treats accidents as inconveniences, while age hoards them as omens. When I reached the meadow, the bells had begun their measured toll. I paused under the arch of Tom Tower, where the stones leaked centuries of water, and listened as the sound folded itself across the city. The great quadrangle beyond stood half in shadow, half in the final glow of the west. Windows glimmered like watchful eyes. I thought of the thousands who had walked here before me, some brilliant, some foolish, most forgotten. And now one more, Latham, erased before I had properly noticed him. A porter leaned against the gatehouse, collar turned up. "Evening, Inspector," he said without emphasis, as if my presence were expected. I had not introduced myself, but then Oxford has always been a village that wears a city's disguise. He spoke again. "You'll have heard." I nodded. "They're saying heart," though he never looked the type. I made no reply. The type to die of a heart is a classification Oxford has never successfully produced. Crossing into the quadrangle, I found myself thinking not of Latham, but of Catullus, whose bitterness has always appealed to me in moments when life offers nothing but shrugs. Odi et amo. I hate and I love. Why it is I do not know, but I feel it and am crucified. Latham had been a classicist. Perhaps the line had lain often on his lips. Perhaps it had accompanied him into whatever darkness had overtaken him. I am not ashamed to admit that I felt the faint stirrings of curiosity, the kind that begins as an irritation and soon becomes an obsession. Too many of my cases began like this, a small noise in the silence, a detail in a newspaper few others would trouble to unfold. But I had learned never to distrust the bells. They call the living and the dead alike, and sometimes they call a policeman who would rather be anywhere else. As I turned to leave, I noticed a scrap of paper wedged in the gate, rain damp, almost illegible. I pulled it free. A crossword clue, scrawled in a hasty hand, "Faithless friend," 6 letters. The answer did not come to me at once, though I carried the fragment in my pocket as I walked back toward Beaumont Street. Later, alone in my flat, I poured a whiskey and unfolded the paper again. Faithless friend, 6 letters, traitor. The solution was too obvious, too pat, yet it lodged in me like grit beneath the skin. I wondered whose hand had written it, and whether Latham had seen it before he died. The bells tolled once more in the distance, striking the hour. I thought of the Don I had never met, the suddenness of his absence, and the way Oxford contrives to keep its secrets hidden behind rain and stone. I finished the whiskey, though it tasted no better than the pint. And so it was that a man I did not know, whose life had brushed only faintly against my own, became the beginning of a story I could not yet name. The invitation came on thick cream paper, the kind that resists folding, as though the weight of tradition lies in its very fibres. I found it slipped beneath my door one morning, addressed with an elegant hand that could only belong to a secretary well trained in the art of discretion. The Dean of Christ Church, it said simply, would be grateful if I could call upon him that evening. Grateful is a curious word. It contains within it both courtesy and threat. By dusk the rain had resumed its patient work, the kind that stains coats rather than drenches them, and the quadrangle gleamed as though polished for some unseen inspection. I crossed Tom Quad with the sense, familiar in Oxford, of being both observed and disregarded. High windows reflected back the lamplight. Somewhere in the cloisters a door closed softly, too softly for accident. The Dean received me in his study, a room that smelt faintly of leather polish and pipe tobacco. Books lined the walls in neat ranks, though I suspected they were chosen for their bindings rather than their contents. He gestured toward a chair with that mixture of affability and authority unique to those who have never been contradicted in earnest. A glass of whiskey appeared as if conjured, and I accepted it with the obedience of habit. "You will have heard," he began, his voice low, shaped by years of sermons and committee meetings, "the death of Dr. Latham." I nodded. He leaned forward, elbows upon the desk, the lamplight catching the small silver cross that hung beneath his gown. "The official account," he continued, "is of sudden illness, but whispers travel faster than fact, and some of those whispers are unsettling." He allowed the word to linger, as though it might gather force in the silence. I asked whether he believed them. He shook his head slowly. "Belief, Inspector, is a complicated matter. My concern is not belief, but reputation. You understand, I am sure." I did not answer, for reputation is a word I have long distrusted. The city is paved with ruined reputations, and still the bells ring. The Dean spoke of the dinner at which Latham had collapsed, a small gathering in one of the college rooms. Nothing remarkable, good claret, harmless conversation. He had excused himself early, complaining of faintness, and was found later in his chambers, lifeless. The doctor had pronounced it a heart seizure. Convenient, I thought again, though I kept the thought to myself. He paused to sip his whiskey, watching me over the rim of the glass. "Some guests have suggested poison," he said at last. "Idle speculation, I hope." "You will understand the importance of ensuring it remains idle." I remarked that rumours cannot be commanded into silence. He smiled thinly. "Then it is your task, perhaps, to see that truth, whatever it may be, is less harmful than the rumour." There was a cough in the corridor outside, quickly stifled. The Dean's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to me. Christchurch is not merely a college, Inspector. It is a symbol, and symbols do not tolerate scandal. I asked whether he had enemies. A faint smile, almost indulgent. Every man of intelligence has enemies, Inspector. The trick is to choose them wisely. As he spoke, I noticed a small detail upon his desk, a half-finished crossword folded beside the lamp. I could not help but glance at it. He followed my eyes and gave a short laugh. A trivial vice of mine, though I confess I rarely finish them. The clue at the top was circled. Betrayal, 5 letters. He had written faith, then scratched it out. I felt a small tightening in my chest, though I could not have said why. The conversation ended with a courtesy that tasted faintly of dismissal. He rose, pressed my hand briefly, and wished me success. Success at what, he did not say. As I stepped out into the cloisters, the rain had eased into mist, and the flagstones shone with a ghostly pallor. I thought of the clue on his desk. Betrayal, 5 letters. The obvious answer was treachery's shorthand, cheat. Yet another possibility flickered across my mind, Judas. It would fit the space perfectly. The bells began to toll again as I crossed the quad, their echoes curling into the night air, like questions that never expected answers. It was Lewis who turned the key, though the porter had been reluctant to surrender it. A fellow's chambers, after all, are not simply rooms. They are reputations pressed into wood and stone. The corridor leading to Latham's staircase smelt faintly of beeswax and damp wool, as if centuries of scholars had left behind little more than polish and rain. The boards creaked beneath our steps in that accusatory way peculiar to old colleges, as though each footfall asked what business we had intruding here. Inside, the air was stale, touched with the residue of smoke and the faint sourness of unfinished wine. I have always distrusted disorder that draws the eye too quickly, for the genuinely untidy never arrange their chaos with such precision. Latham's rooms were scattered in the right degree. A jacket slung over a chair, papers left half-sorted on the desk, 2 glasses resting on a low table. But it was the second glass that held my attention. The faint rim of lipstick, barely visible in the half-light, suggested he had not been drinking alone. Lewis noted the book open on the desk. Catullus, I observed, my finger brushing the margin. A line had been underlined, though the hand was careless. Odi et amo, I hate and I love. Nothing unusual, but beside it someone had scribbled a misquotation from Tennyson. I read it twice before recognizing the error. The hand was not Latham's. That much I felt certain of. The letters leaned too far to the right, impatient, almost irritated with the page itself. On the wall above the desk hung a crossword puzzle pinned by a brass tack. Half completed, several clues filled in with an untidy scrawl. I read them aloud to myself in silence. Betrayer, Judas. Deceiver, cheat. Too many answers repeat the same theme. I asked Lewis what he thought. He shrugged. Nothing strange about crosswords, sir, but I had already begun to feel the faint itch of unease. One clue remained unanswered. Faithless companion, 6 letters. A small echo of the scrap I had found in the gate. We searched further. A diary lay in the drawer, bound in brown leather. Flipping through, I noticed a tear where a page had been neatly removed, the fibres frayed just enough to suggest haste. I closed it without comment. The absence of a thing often tells more than the presence. Lewis remarked on the books along the shelf. Greek texts, annotated with meticulous care. But here and there I saw gaps, as though certain volumes had been withdrawn recently. One space in particular drew my eye. The dust still outlined where a book had been. I traced the gap with my finger, though I could not yet guess what title had been taken. The room yielded small things: a cigarette case with only one left, a photograph of undergraduates at some summer fete, Latham younger and less lined, his expression caught between pride and embarrassment. A man who carried vanity awkwardly, perhaps. At the window I paused. Rain had darkened the stone sill, though the catch was still drawn. Someone had opened it recently, letting in the smell of wet earth from the quad below. A trivial observation, perhaps, but I have often found that death and fresh air keep awkward company. I asked Lewis what struck him most. He considered. "The 2 glasses, sir?" I nodded. Yes, the 2 glasses, one host, one guest, and a conversation that left no witnesses. Before leaving, I returned once more to the crossword on the wall. It was the handwriting again, hurried, irregular. It seemed to echo the scrawl in the margin of Catullus. I could not say for certain, but I felt the hand belonged to the same person, and if that were true, then someone had not only drunk with Latham, but left behind the small graffiti of their mind. People betray themselves most clearly when they believe no one is watching. As we stepped back into the corridor, the porter waited, anxious to relock the door. He asked quietly whether all had been in order. I told him it had been untidy, only untidy. He seemed relieved, though I did not know why. Later, walking away from the college, I carried with me the image of that missing diary page and the lipstick trace on the rim of a glass. Small things, easily ignored, yet they pressed upon me with the weight of inevitability. The dead leave behind their silences, and it is the task of the living to listen. It is always the same at the start of an inquiry. The gradual assembling of faces, the polite exchanges, the early impressions one knows will later prove false. Each person who drifts into view carries both their innocence and their guilt, and one must be patient enough to let time do the sifting. I began with Professor Margaret Ellison. She met me in the senior common room, her gown trailing like a shadow behind her. A sharp woman, precise in her speech, her eyes giving the impression that she had already read the questions before I asked them. She spoke of Latham with that mixture of respect and irritation reserved for colleagues who have prospered. "A brilliant mind," she said, though careless. It is always easier to be careless when others are left to tidy the fragments. Her lips tightened on the word careless, and I wondered whether she meant books or people. Later I spoke with Dr. Julian March, a man still too young for the lines of ambition that already marked his forehead. He wore the look of someone not quite comfortable in his own, clothes as if the gown of fellowship sat too heavily upon his shoulders. He described Latham as a mentor, though there was little warmth in his tone. When I asked whether he had been present at the dinner, he hesitated. Yes, though he left early. A faint flush coloured his cheeks at the admission, and he busied himself with the stack of papers on his desk. I thought then of the missing book on Latham's shelf, and of how easily protégés become rivals when the paths of advancement narrow. Catherine Brooke, the archivist, greeted me in a room that smelt of vellum and dust, where the light filtered through high windows as though reluctant to intrude. She was elegant, restrained, with the kind of composure that does not reveal itself in conversation, but in silence. She said she had admired Latham's scholarship, though her tone suggested distance rather than admiration. I asked if she had known him personally. She paused, then said only that scholars often find themselves in each other's company. Her hands lingered on the clasp of a folio as she spoke, tightening and releasing it in a rhythm that betrayed a tension otherwise absent from her face. I thought of the second glass in Latham's chambers, the trace of lipstick on the rim. The last of the circle was Father James Hale, the college chaplain. He received me in his rooms where the air was thick with incense, though the smell could not disguise the faint tang of cigarette smoke. He was a man who carried his faith like a cloak, visible, heavy, but easily set aside when convenient. He spoke of Latham as one might speak of a difficult parishioner. Brilliant, yes, but irreverent, sometimes cruel in debate. The world is full of men who mistake cynicism for wisdom, he said with a sigh. When I asked whether he had seen Latham on the night of his death, he admitted he had passed him briefly in the quad. Their exchange had been perfunctory. I did not press further, though the way he stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force suggested more than he allowed. As I listened to them all, I could not help noticing the subtle repetitions, the words brilliant, careless, difficult. Each of them had chosen the same vocabulary as though rehearsed. Yet each word was edged with something sharper: envy, resentment, regret. A man may die of the heart, but envy corrodes long before. One detail lingered with me as the evening drew on. In Ellison's conversation, she quoted a line from Tennyson. "Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers," she said, with the authority of one accustomed to being right. Yet I knew the line was not quite so. Wisdom lingers, yes, but knowledge fades. That is the sense, though the words differ. And it was the same misquotation I had found scrawled in the margin of Latham's Catullus. A small thing, a slip of the tongue. But slips often mark the path. When I left the college that night, the rain had begun again, steady and unremarkable, dripping from the gargoyles onto the worn stone below. I thought of the circle of suspects, each so cultured, so intelligent, so ready to drape their words in civility. And I wondered, not for the first time, how easily civility conceals the quiet brutality of ambition. The bells sounded once more, indifferent as ever, carrying into the darkness the faint echo of betrayals yet unnamed. There is a moment at college dinners, just before the port begins its unhurried circuit, when the hall settles into a kind of theatre. The candles throw shadows against portraits of men long dead, and the voices soften to the register of cultivated ease. I had been invited, more as an observer than a guest, though Oxford never admits to such distinctions. The food was plain but heavy with tradition. Beef, followed by a pudding that stuck obstinately to the spoon. My thoughts wandered as they always did, yet I listened without appearing to. The conversations at high tables are like crosswords, fragments of knowledge intersecting, words half understood, solutions deferred. It was Professor Ellison who caught my attention once more. She spoke with the certainty of someone rehearsing a lecture, and her voice carried just enough to command the table. "Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers," she declared, raising her glass as if proposing a toast to her own erudition. A murmur of assent followed, yet I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The misquotation again. I had read Tennyson too often not to know. The true line is wisdom lingers, but knowledge fades. The difference is not pedantic, it is essential. Knowledge is transient, wisdom is stubborn. Ellison had inverted the sense, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps not. But it was the same inversion I had seen in Latham's Catullus, scribbled in haste at the margin. The same impatience in the script, the same inclination to force a thought where it did not belong. I let my gaze drift across the table. Julian March avoided Ellison's eyes, concentrating too intently on his glass. Catherine Brooks sat further down, silent, her fingers tracing the rim of her plate as though she were listening to some other conversation entirely. Father Hale, meanwhile, seemed absorbed in the wine, swirling it with the care of a man contemplating transubstantiation. Each of them wore civility like a borrowed cloak. When the dean rose to speak, his voice carried the weary dignity of office. He spoke of the late Dr. Latham with carefully measured sorrow, reminding those gathered of his brilliance, his service to scholarship, his contribution to the college. I noted how each phrase skirted around the man himself, as if the less said of his character the better. Reputation again, the college's favourite relic. Afterwards, in the buttery, I found myself beside March. He was nervous, glancing about as though each question were a trap. I asked whether he had often worked with Latham on translation. He admitted he had. Did he recall Latham's habit of marginalia? He nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, he said, always scribbling, never neat. I asked whether the errors were frequent. He hesitated. Only when quoting others, he said, and the faintest smile crossed his lips, a smile too private to share. Back in my rooms later that night, I turned the matter over, whiskey in hand, the rain once again pressing at the window, a small error of quotation repeated by two different mouths in two different settings. Coincidence is a word detectives use only when they are tired. I unfolded the crossword scrap once more. Faithless friend, 6 letters, traitor. Yet another clue echoed in Latham's pinned puzzle, betrayer, Judas, all the words circling the same theme, as though the dead man had been haunted by betrayal in the days before his collapse. And betrayal, I reflected, is seldom a solitary game. It struck me then that Ellison's misquotation was not simply a slip of memory, it was a habit, a signature. The impatient desire to reshape words until they suited her purpose. Perhaps it was nothing more than vanity. But perhaps Latham had noticed, as I had, and left it marked in the margin, his own quiet accusation in Latin ink. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear her voice at the table. Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers, wrong, and yet delivered with such authority that the hall had nodded in agreement. That was Oxford in miniature, I thought. The confident assertion of error, applauded by those too polite to contradict. The bells began to toll again, muffled by rain, and I wrote a single word on the corner of the newspaper lying beside me. Judas. It stared back at me, stark and unyielding. I drained the last of the whiskey, and wondered, not for the first time, whether truth and error were less opposed than entwined. The archives of Christchurch lie behind a door that resists intrusion, not because of any obvious lock, but because of the weight of centuries pressing against it. Dust is a kind of gatekeeper in such places, reminding all who enter that time will always be the true custodian. Catherine Brooke met me there, the keys at her waist rattling faintly like distant bells. She guided me through the narrow aisles where shelves rose like solemn witnesses. The air smelt of vellum and dust, touched faintly by polish. She moved with an elegance that was almost rehearsed, her hand brushing the edges of the bindings as though assuring them of her loyalty. She asked whether I had seen the college's treasures before. I admitted I had not. My duties rarely afforded me the luxury of admiration. She smiled without warmth. Few men understand the beauty of what is hidden, she said. On the table, she set a small bundle of letters. Among them was one addressed to Latham. The handwriting was sharp, impatient, the lines slanting forward as though anxious to be finished. It was signed only with initials, M.E. The words within were cryptic, a reference to betrayal, to silence, to an understanding broken. It was not a letter of affection, though it had once been close enough to touch it. I asked whether she knew the writer. Her hand lingered too long on the edge of the page before she said, "I do not involve myself in the private affairs of fellows." Yet the tightening of her jaw betrayed the cost of such restraint. We moved further into the archives. She unlocked a cabinet with deliberate slowness, the kind of ceremony that suggests the contents are less valuable than the impression of control. Inside were wills, parish records, fragments of sermons, the residue of lives reduced to script. She insisted nothing here concerned Latham. The insistence was too polished, too quick. As she closed the cabinet, I noticed her sleeve brush the dust from its rim. A small, fresh smear of absence appeared where her hand had passed, as if something had been removed recently. The dust told a truth her words had denied. I said nothing. Instead, I asked about Latham's habits in the archives. She admitted he had spent long hours here, often requesting old correspondence, particularly from the 19th century. What he sought, she could not say. She paused, then added, "He liked to leave notes." When I asked what kind of notes, she opened a drawer and withdrew a slip of paper folded in half. It was a line of Latin, familiar yet altered. Amicus perfidus, faithless friend. Again, the same refrain echoing from the crossword, from the scrap of paper, from the words pinned to his wall. I asked if she had found it. She hesitated. "He left it in a volume of Catullus," she said. Her voice softened on the name, as though confessing something more intimate. Her composure began to fray. She asked if the investigation would go on much longer, whether rumours could be contained. I replied that rumours are like ink spilt on vellum. Once absorbed, they cannot be erased. She looked away then, and I knew her interest in Latham had reached beyond the professional. The lipstick trace on the glass returned to me like an echo. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a key lying among her set. Brass, older than the rest, worn smooth at the teeth. She caught my glance. "An old cabinet," she said too quickly. "Hardly used." I thought of the empty space on Latham's bookshelf, the missing page in his diary. Hardly used. Yet every absence had begun to form a pattern, faint but insistent. Outside, the cloisters were damp with mist, the stones shining faintly under the lamplight. I carried with me the weight of that letter, the initials pressed into the paper like a seal of unfinished anger. MEA Fellow of the College, initials too easy to match. Yet I let the thought drift, unanchored, into the silence. The bells tolled once again as I stepped beyond the gate, their sound heavy, mournful, reminding me that Oxford never forgets its dead. It only hides them among the living. It was Lewis who first placed the file before me. He had the air of a man proud to have unearthed something solid among so much smoke. Banked, statements, drafts of papers, fragments of correspondence. I spread them on my desk, the lamplight catching their edges, and saw at once what he wished me to see, passages lifted whole from Latham's earlier articles, reworked without acknowledgement into the fledgling essays of Dr. Julian March. Plagiarism is an old vice in Oxford, and a convenient one. No blood spilt, no scandal too loud, yet reputations are quietly destroyed in its wake. I sat back, the whiskey untouched beside me, and thought of March's nervous eyes at dinner, his hurried words about mentorship. Was it mentorship or theft dressed in the robes of loyalty? The following day I sought him out in his rooms. The staircase smelt of damp wool, the floorboards groaning in mild protest as I ascended. He received me stiffly, the air of someone half expecting accusation. His desk was crowded with papers, too crowded, as if the clutter itself were a defence. I remarked that I had been reading some of his work. He flushed, and the pen in his hand stilled. I asked whether he and Latham had collaborated. He replied that they had, of course, though Latham had been generous in permitting him to borrow lines, even ideas. Generous was his word, and it lingered oddly in the room. I asked whether he had written late on the night of Latham's death. His answer came too quickly. Yes, all night, alone. There was a silence then, filled only by the faint tick of a clock. I glanced at his shelves. Among the volumes was a gap, dust-marked like the one I had noticed in Latham's rooms. A missing title once stood there, and I wondered whether it had travelled the short distance between mentor and protégé. I let the thought pass unspoken. Lewis later was eager to close the net. If March had been exposed by Latham, if the older man had threatened to reveal the plagiarism, then the motive was clear enough. Ambition has undone greater men than he. And yet something about the neatness of it all irritated me. Truth is rarely symmetrical. I thought again of the crossword pinned to Latham's wall. Betrayer, Judas, deceiver, cheat. Words chosen not by accident. But was March clever enough to cloak his guilt in so many literary allusions? His cheeks flushed too easily, his hands trembled when he lifted a pen. No, I felt. He lacked the stillness of the practiced deceiver. His crime, if crime it was, lay in vanity and weakness, not in murder. Still I pressed further. I asked him, as we stood by his window, whether he recalled Latham's last words to him. He hesitated, then said that Latham had spoken of deadlines, of revisions, of the importance of polish. His voice cracked slightly as he imitated them, and I saw in that moment the child still seeking approval. Murderers, in my experience, do not mimic the cadences of their victims with such tenderness, yet I could not dismiss him. The evidence sat on my desk, ink and paper, accusing more loudly than any witness. I spent a restless night turning the matter over, whiskey after whiskey, refusing to dull the unease. I remembered March's hands, their nervous flutter, hands that could not hold a glass without trembling. And yet the glass in Latham's rooms had been set down firmly, its lipstick trace intact, no shiver in its line. In the end, it was a minor deduction that saved me from premature certainty. Among March's papers I found a half-finished crossword, abandoned on his desk. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the letters upright and disciplined. Nothing of the hurried scrawl that marred the puzzle pinned in Latham's rooms. 2 hands, 2 temperaments. The small difference told me more than any confession. So March remained within the circle of suspicion, but his place was at its edge, not its centre. A young man guilty of ambition, of theft perhaps, but not, I felt in my bones, of the final betrayal that had left a fellow lifeless in his chambers. The rain fell again that night, soft against the window, and I thought of how Oxford conspires to protect its own, even as it devours them. March was no murderer, but innocence in this city is never untainted. I had grown accustomed, over the years, to the particular odour of clergy rooms, a mix of incense and dust, occasionally interrupted by the sharper tang of tobacco. Father James Hale's chambers were no exception. The crucifix on the wall was polished to the point of distraction, but beneath it the ashtray told a different truth. Half-buried cigarettes, lipstick traces faintly visible on one. He offered me tea, though his hand lingered longer than necessary on the whiskey bottle before pushing it aside. His voice, when he spoke, carried the sonority of sermons, yet there was something rehearsed about it, as if even conversation were liturgy. He described Latham with a tone that balanced courtesy against disdain. A brilliant man, he said, though incapable of reverence, always eager to prove what he did not believe. I asked whether he had argued with him. His eyes flicked toward the window, as if the damp stones of the quad might rescue him. Debate, he said finally, is the lifeblood of a college. Yet the word carried a bitterness too strong for mere intellectual sparring. On the desk before him lay a half-finished sermon. I glanced at the sheet. The text wrestled with the betrayal of Christ, Judas framed not as villain, but as necessary actor in the great narrative. I asked whether betrayal had preoccupied him lately. His hands closed over the paper, folding it in half. The gospel is always about betrayal, Inspector. That does not make me a murderer. Still the cigarette ends in the tray unsettled me. One of them bore lipstick, faint but undeniable. I thought of the glass in Latham's chambers, the rim stained in the same quiet way. Oxford is a city of converging traces. Sometimes they meet only by chance, sometimes by conspiracy. Lewis had been busy in the meantime. He arrived with the discreet triumph of a man holding facts like contraband. Hale, it seemed, had debts, gambling debts tucked away behind the facade of cassock and ritual. A bookmaker in Jericho had spoken of a clergyman who placed wagers with the zeal of a sinner testing providence. The description fit too neatly to ignore. If Latham had discovered the secret, if he had threatened exposure, then motive was plain. A man ruined in reputation might strike quickly to preserve it. Lewis thought the case all but solved, but the simplicity of it disturbed me. Guilt, in Oxford, rarely arranges itself so tidily. I returned to Hale once more, this time in the chapel itself. The candles burned low, shadows climbing the carved stalls. He stood by the lectern, the faint scent of tobacco clinging even here. I asked whether Latham had known of his debts. Hale did not answer at first. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, "He knew enough." And then, more softly, "He knew too much." It was almost a confession, but it rang hollow. There was resignation in it, not menace. A man admitting his vulnerability, not his crime. I thought of the sermon draft again, of Judas necessary to the story, and wondered if Hale saw himself in that mirror, condemned not by action, but by role. The small deduction came to me as I watched him stub out another cigarette at the chapel door. He used his left hand awkwardly, almost painfully, and yet the scrawl on Latham's crossword, the impatient script in the Catullus margin, those belonged to a right hand, swift and slanted. The detail seemed minor, but it settled in my mind with the certainty of logic. Hale had his secrets, but murder was not among them. When I left the chapel, the rain had eased into drizzle, the flagstones shining with a sheen that seemed almost deliberate. Lewis was waiting by the gate, eager for confirmation. I told him only that the chaplain was guilty of debts, of weakness, perhaps of envy, but not of the final betrayal that had ended in death. The bells began to toll again across the meadow, slow and mournful. I listened to their echo and thought of Hale standing beneath his crucifix, rehearsing betrayal in sermon after sermon, while carrying his own private ruin like a hidden wound. In Oxford, sins are seldom spectacular. They are shabby, worn thin by repetition, and almost always disguised as something else. I had grown accustomed by then to the silence of my flat, broken only by the scrape of pencil across newsprint. Crosswords were both discipline and distraction, a way of proving daily that order might still be coaxed from chaos. Yet that night, with the rain slanting against the window and the whiskey glass half drained, my attention returned not to my own puzzle, but to Latham's. It had been pinned to his wall, half solved, the handwriting impatient, angular, as though the writer wished to finish quickly and be done with words. At the time, I had noticed only the repetition: Judas, cheat, betrayer. Now, staring at the copy I had made in my notebook, I saw the pattern more clearly. Each clue circled the same theme, as if the compiler or solver had been consumed by it. Betrayal not once, but many times. Faithless companion, 6 letters. The clue that had followed me like a shadow since that first evening. I wrote out the possibilities: traitor, Judas, friendless. Yet none satisfied me. I had the uneasy sense that the clue was less about solution than obsession. I walked across to the bookcase, pulled down my Catullus. The pages opened easily at the familiar line, Odi et amo, I hate and I love. It was not a crossword clue, yet it felt like one, the solution always unsatisfactory. I remembered the marginal misquotation in Latham's volume, the same slip I had heard from Ellison's lips at dinner. Knowledge comes, but wisdom lingers. Wrong and yet repeated with conviction. A signature error, like handwriting or voice. The deduction was hardly spectacular, but it pressed upon me with the quiet insistence of truth. Whoever had left those marks in Latham's book, whoever had scrawled so urgently across the crossword, was the same person who misquoted Tennyson with such authority. The professor's words had betrayed her more thoroughly than any confession. Still I hesitated. Coincidence has ruined many an investigation, and I am not immune to its lure. Could two minds make the same slip? Yes, of course. But could they do so in the same circle, in the same weeks, while the air itself seemed saturated with betrayal? That I doubted. I recalled Ellison at the table, her glass raised, her lips curling faintly around the quotation. The hall had nodded, approving, and I alone had winced at the error. To most it was nothing. To me it was everything. It echoed too loudly against the margin in Catullus, against the crossword pinned like a silent accusation. Later I walked the length of the Broad, the stones slick with rain, the gas lamps smearing their light against the wet pavement. I thought of Latham alone in his chambers, of two glasses on the table, one rimmed faintly with lipstick. I thought of the missing page in his diary, torn hurriedly, perhaps to erase the trace of a visitor whose presence could not be admitted. Crosswords, diaries, quotations, wine glasses, small things, trivial things. Yet I have learned that truth resides not in declarations but in fragments. Betrayal reveals itself in half-finished puzzles and careless words. Back in my flat I wrote her initials beneath the crossword copy. M.E. Margaret Ellison. I let the letters sit on the page, heavy, undeniable, and yet even then I could not close the book. Guilt in Oxford is never pure. It carries with it the sediment of envy, of disappointment, of love, soured into something harder. I refilled the glass, listening to Wagner on the radio, the music unfolding with its familiar inexorability. Betrayal, 6 letters. The puzzle refused to rest, though the answer was already on my tongue. The bells of Christ Church tolled the hour, solemn, unhurried. I set down my pencil and whispered the word I had known from the first, Judas. The cloisters of Christ Church at night are not a place for certainty. The lamps burn low, the air smells of wet stone and candle smoke drifting from unseen chapels, and footsteps echo in ways that confuse their origin. It was there I met her, Professor Margaret Ellison, her gown drawn tight against the damp, her face pale in the thin light. She had agreed, almost carelessly, to speak with me. Carelessness has always been a mask. We walked slowly beneath the arches, our words barely rising above the hush. She spoke first of Latham, her tone balancing disdain with memory. He was brilliant, she said, brilliant and insufferable, never content unless he was exposing another's folly. I asked if she had loved him once. Her silence was long enough to be its own confession. Then, softly, she admitted, in youth, we all mistake arrogance for brilliance. I asked whether their meetings had continued beyond youth. She smiled without humour. The college thrives on speculation, Inspector. It hardly needs my contribution. But her eyes betrayed her. The quick dart to the shadowed stone, the tightening of her hand on her sleeve. I recalled the lipstick trace on the glass, the missing page from Latham's diary. Presence erased, yet never completely. She turned the subject to scholarship, her voice sharpening as though she had retreated into safer ground. He borrowed freely, she said, ideas, phrases, even from me. I asked if she meant plagiarism. No, she replied, though her bitterness coloured the denial. He borrowed my time, my energy, my years, and when he was finished, he left me the fragments. We paused where the cloisters opened briefly to the quadrangle. Rain streaked the stones, the air carrying the faint echo of the meadow beyond. I thought then of the crossword, the scrawled handwriting, the repeated theme of betrayal. I asked her, almost idly, if she enjoyed puzzles. She looked at me quickly, too quickly, and asked why. I mentioned a crossword pinned in Latham's rooms, filled with words of treachery. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only the faintest exhalation, like a sigh she had forgotten to disguise. It was enough. The deduction had already been made elsewhere, in her careless misquotation of Tennyson, in the impatient hand that scrawled itself across Catullus. But here, in the cloisters, silence confirmed what words had denied. Still I pressed gently. I told her that Latham had been seen that night with another glass upon his table. She said nothing. I mentioned the missing page in his diary. Her eyes closed briefly, then opened, resigned. He had kept a record of everything, she whispered, even of me. And then at last, the truth, though whispered not in confession, but in weariness. I had gone to him that night. I had written him letters. I had tried to make him understand what he had cost me. He laughed, Inspector. He laughed as though none of it mattered. So I left him my parting gift. Her voice faltered then, but steadied. Just enough in the wine, not much. Enough. The word echoed in the stone vault above us. Enough. She did not weep, nor did her voice rise in anger. It was the quietest admission I had ever heard. She had believed he would survive. He always had before, through drink, through excess. But he had not, and the silence of the cloisters seemed to close around the fact. I asked whether she regretted it. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I thought I saw the young woman she must once have been, fierce and unguarded. Then it was gone. Regret, she said softly, is a luxury. We walked the remainder of the cloister in silence. At the archway she paused, her hand resting on the stone as though it might steady her. He betrayed me first, she whispered. The words lingered between us, ambiguous, suspended. Then she turned away, her gown brushing the flagstones, and vanished into the quadrangle. I stood alone, listening to the bells beginning their slow toll across the city. The sound carried through the arches, through the rain, through the centuries themselves. A man had died, a woman had spoken, and still the bells told nothing but time. The dean summoned me the following afternoon. The rain had left the quad glistening, each flagstone a dull mirror, and the sky pressed low upon the spires with the heaviness of an unspoken thought. I walked slowly beneath Tom Tower, reluctant, as always, to meet authority in its most polished form. His study was warm, fire licking at the grate, the smell of leather and pipe smoke lingering like an old sermon. He motioned me to sit without words, and when he finally spoke it was with that careful courtesy which is itself a kind of command. "You have learned more than is convenient, Inspector." I asked what he meant by convenient. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window. "Truth," he said, "is never inconvenient in itself, but the timing, the audience, the consequences, those can ruin us all." He spoke of Ellison with a detachment that might have passed for mercy. A brilliant scholar, an irreplaceable mind, a woman who had given her life to the college. He did not deny her failings, nor even her guilt, though he never used the word. He simply asked whether public scandal would serve any purpose beyond destruction. I reminded him that a man was dead. He did not flinch. A man who, by all accounts, brought ruin upon himself long before she placed the glass in his hand. "Are you certain, Inspector, that justice is always best served in daylight?" His voice was steady, yet behind it I caught the faint quiver of calculation. The fire cracked in the grate. I thought of the crossword, of betrayal written again and again, of Catullus, underlined in a hand not his own. The pieces lay before me like tiles on a board, forming a pattern I could no longer deny. Yet what would come of arranging them for the world to see? The dean was right about one thing: the college would survive, but not without cost. Lewis had asked me earlier whether Ellison would stand trial. I had avoided the answer. Now the dean pressed it upon me. "Do you intend to proceed?" he asked. His tone was calm, almost paternal, but the question carried weight. I looked at him then and thought of the many generations who had sat in that same study, men who had weighed silence against revelation and chosen, more often than not, to preserve the stone walls rather than the fragile truth. It is the nature of institutions to prefer continuity to honesty. I told him that the evidence was circumstantial. A misquotation, a scrawl on a crossword, a missing diary page, a letter signed with initials. Enough to satisfy the restless mind, perhaps, but not the courts. He nodded once, a gesture of solemn approval. "Then perhaps, Inspector, we may let the dead rest." He poured another glass of whiskey and slid it across the desk toward me. I accepted it, though it tasted faintly of defeat. We sat in silence a long while, the rain tapping against the leaded panes, the fire muttering in its low voice. At last he said, "You have done your duty." Sometimes that means knowing when to stop. When I left his study, the corridors were empty, the stone echoing beneath my steps. I thought of Ellison, her voice in the cloisters, regret framed not as sorrow but as necessity. I thought of Latham, lifeless among his books, his crossword unfinished. And I thought of myself, carrying truths too fragile to speak aloud. The small deduction came later as I passed the gatehouse. The porter glanced at me and then looked quickly away, as though afraid of what he might be asked. Even he knew. The college had already closed its circle of discretion, each member complicit in silence. As the bells tolled the hour, slow and inexorable, I realized that nothing further would come of the case. Justice, such as it was, had been delivered not in court but in whispers. Oxford has always preferred its betrayals that way. There are nights when Oxford seems to fold in upon itself, the cloisters and spires withdrawing into shadow, as though the city wishes to keep its secrets unspoken. That night was such a night. I returned to my flat with the case concluded, or abandoned, depending on one's taste for words, and found the silence more oppressive than any verdict. The gramophone offered Wagner, as it often did, when I had nothing else to hold on to. The overture filled the room with a grandeur that mocked my own exhaustion. I poured a measure of whiskey, though I no longer trusted it to sharpen or soften anything. The glass felt heavier than it should, as though it carried more than liquid. On the table lay the copy of Latham's crossword, folded, worn at the creases. I smoothed it flat and traced the words again with my finger. Judas, cheat, betrayer, each one stark, accusing, repetitive, to the point of obsession. One clue remained: faithless friend, 6 letters. I wrote the answer slowly, almost ceremonially. Traitor. The pencil line was faint, but the meaning unyielding. And yet, even in the quiet certainty of solution, I felt the unease of incompletion. Truth had been glimpsed, yes, but not held. Ellison had confessed without confessing, admitted without surrender. The dean had urged silence, his discretion sanctified by centuries of precedent. Justice had been bartered for continuity, and I had allowed it. I thought of Ellison in the cloisters, her voice low, her gown brushing the flagstones. He betrayed me first, she had said. Was it justification, or simply memory? In Oxford, the line is thin. The city thrives on betrayals dressed as scholarship, loyalties rewritten in the margins. Latham's death had been less a murder than a footnote in that larger text. The bells struck midnight, their sound heavy, echoing across the meadow and into my flat. I listened as though each toll were a reminder of unfinished duties. Beyond midnight, time no longer belongs to the living. It drifts, unclaimed, between memory and regret. I poured another whiskey and let my mind wander back through the fragments, the lipstick rim on the glass, the missing diary page, the hurried scrawl on the crossword, the misquotation of Tennyson. Small things easily overlooked, yet together they form the faint outline of a story. Not the whole story, never that, but enough to know, enough to leave me restless. I wondered whether Latham had seen the betrayal coming. He had underlined Catullus after all. Odi et amo. I hate and I love. Did he read his own fate in those words, or did he believe himself untouchable, safe within the walls of college privilege? Perhaps both. Pride and blindness often share the same glass. The music swelled, then faltered, the record nearing its end. I let it spin out, the needle scratching faintly against silence, as though even the machine resisted closure. I did not lift it. There are moments when endings must be allowed to unravel without interference. At last I closed the crossword, folded it once, and slipped it back into the drawer. The word traitor remained unsolved in any official sense, though I had written it down. The city would go on, the dons would dine, the dean would smoke his pipe and speak of reputation. And I would carry the unfinished truth as I had carried others, like a tune half remembered. The bells sounded once more, a straggling echo beyond midnight. I raised the glass, not in toast but in resignation, and let the whiskey burn against the silence. And so it ended, not with revelation, not with justice, but with the quiet ache of knowing too much and saying too little. Oxford slept, the rain pressed against the window, and I sat alone with betrayal, unfinished, like the final line of a poem I had never learned to recite.